And we welcome everybody to the second day of our International Building Exhibition Research Lab here in Vienna with the title New Social Housing. This year in 2020, we selected the theme Climate Adaptation and Mitigation in Social Housing, Local and Bottom-up Perspectives. And this morning's session will be about infrastructure and about design within this context. Chris, the session will be coordinated and moderated by Christoph Reinprecht, who is sitting just opposite of me, and myself. I'm Simon Güntner. We're both professors of sociology at the University of Vienna and at the Technical University of Vienna. And we are hosting and organizing the research lab in close coordination and thankfully also financed by the City of Vienna and the International Building Exhibition. As a very short introduction, I'm going to fill those people who've not been with us yesterday or in the last years in and give a very brief, hopefully not longer than 5-6 minutes, introduction to why we do this and where we come from. After this, I'm going to introduce and welcome our panel, which is a set of distinguished experts from various disciplines. We're very, very thankful and happy that you agreed to be with us today, who are then going to kick off the discussion with a brief statement, each of them. We ask you to prepare a statement for about 5 minutes with your view on the theme, and afterwards we have presentations by people who are here with us in the room. We're going to have a number of case studies, and after the case studies we're going to have discussion. And thankfully we're going to manage time so well that we might have a brief break in between to relax ourselves from sitting on the screen or in the room. So, the International Building Exhibition in Vienna is going to happen in 2022, and the theme there is New Social Housing. You might all know that the City of Vienna is very proud about its history of social housing, and quite rightly so. There's many things to be proud about, and it's a very specific and very complex approach to social housing that's been there, that emerged over the last 100 years, but every system can be improved. So at some point, the director of housing research in the city, within the city administration, decided, let's have an international building exhibition, which is quite special, because let's not spend lots of money on building something new. Of course, they're going to do this too, or they're doing this at the moment. But let's also reflect on where we've come from. And they chose the topic New Social Housing. And within this, with a question mark, we can add this question mark to it and ask ourselves, what should social housing be in the future? And as a part of this, they support an annual research lab, which is kind of a take on a summer school, which brings together international scholars from various levels, so junior scholars, PhD students, but also activists who have at least one hat on with regards to practice in social innovation in housing, etc. And but also experts from all over the world who have experience in social housing research and and we assume that they have something important to contribute to this theme. And we broke down over the last years the overall title, New Social Housing, into various kind of subtitles or specific themes that we together with the City of Vienna think and thought are crucial to look at. And then we started in 2018 with a summer school on the transformation of large-scale housing, in particular housing from the 1960s and 70s, and looked at numerous examples of transformation and all the challenges that are included there. And one of the issues that came out of this and then led to the theme in 2019 was that we, maybe not so surprisingly, discovered that the understanding of social, the connotation of social, varied dramatically between participants. What is social housing? It means something different in every context, in every institutional context, in every spatial context, in various contexts of practice. There's no trademark on social housing. And what the City of Vienna perceives as social housing is something totally different than what, for instance, some actors from Southern America perceive as social housing. So we had a really exciting discussion, and we decided in 2019 to open the question, what is social about social housing? So we went quite deep, and one of the things, I mean, many things came up, but one of the things that came up were about the relation between formal structures and informal processes and informal arrangements in housing, and even in a very structured and well-organized city like Vienna, informal aspects really play a huge role when it comes to housing. We can deepen this later on, but from this discussion about what is social about social housing, one of the elements that we took from there was that in these years, in particular in the transformation of existing stock, there is a trade-off. There's a game going on, and there's a balance to be stricken. You say stricken? To be struck between ecological goals and social goals, between ecological justice and social justice. Because we've seen there's a term that emerged, which was called renoviction. We saw that many structures are physically transformed these days in order to meet ecological goals, energy efficiency, etc. But that comes with a cost, and that cost needs to be paid by someone. So we decided, let's look at this game, or at this challenge in this year. This is how we came about to look at climate adaptation in social housing, and we then put a particular focus on this and said, let's look at local and bottom-up perspectives on this challenge, or on this task. And from various continents, and we asked ourselves and participants a number of questions regarding these projects, or this thing. And one of the things, of course, that is the main job of such a research lab or a summer school, is to learn from existing research. What do we know? That is, what is the state of the art on this thing? And we ask this for us as researchers to learn from each other, but also because we want to transmit this knowledge to policy here in Vienna. So we want to, after these sessions, we want to have some points that we can share with decision makers and policy makers here, that they might consider when they move towards 2022, and are looking for answers on what new social housing could do. And with regard to this, there were three more specific questions, and we organized various sessions around these. And one is this: if we look at local and bottom-up initiatives, how they come about, and more crucially, how can they become sustainable, so that they're not one-off, but that the communities that emerge, the empowerment that takes place in this process, that this is sustained. And for the city of Vienna, or for us here, it's a crucial question related to this, is how can public institutions actually respond and support such initiatives and processes. A second question, which is crucial to this theme, is the issue of infrastructure, and that's something that we're going to look at now, today, this morning. How does there's specific infrastructure needed for climate adaptation with regard to cooling, shelter, other mitigating effects, and how does this relate to infrastructure that is already there in our cities and other common goods? How are these managed? How do they relate to each other? One of the things that we discussed last year that was in our minds when we invited you was, for instance, the relation between heating and cooling. For a long time, the heating infrastructure in buildings was not meant to also have the effect or be used for cooling. But it could be. So that is a challenge, and it's just one of many examples. And the third question we asked was in relation to this, with regard to architecture and planning. How can sites, so either as well buildings, dwellings and houses, but also the surrounding urban spaces, so buildings and places, how can they be designed in a way that the design itself promotes climate-friendly modes of living? These are the questions that we have ahead of us, and we're going to discuss these questions with brief statements and case studies, and we hope that by the end of this morning, we do have some some ideas on how we can respond to them. I won't go into the detail of the program, only to say that between now and 12:30 Viennese time, we're going to look at blue and green infrastructure, and we're going to look at mitigating design. This afternoon, we're going to change the format, and we're going to look at some projects in Vienna with the people who are physically here. And this evening, that's quite a task for Christoph and me, because this evening we're going to bring some of the messages from yesterday and today to a panel of policymakers and practitioners here in Vienna. So we're going to have a panel discussion, public panel discussion this evening, which we have to open, and so we bring the discussion there, and they will respond to it, and we hopefully take something forward for the International Building Exhibition. Our faculty, which is the experts who are invited to bring forward some statements and then to react to the papers, are Laura Collini from Berlin and Florence, Celine de Cruz, who is currently in Bangladesh, Roberta Kuka, who is here this morning with us. Hello, Roberta. From Oslo, Abdulmalik Simone, who was with us yesterday, who's based currently in Sheffield. Yuri Katsupov was with us yesterday, who's based in Vienna. Sasha Rösler, welcome, Sasha. I think you're currently based in Berlin, as far as I understand, but basically you're
in Zurich. Now again.
You were in Berlin, but currently in Zurich. Pankit from the LSE, good morning. And Sophie Watson, who unfortunately can't be with us for health reasons. So thank you all for coming. We're looking forward to your statements. But before we do this, well, I promised it's not longer than 5 minutes, but actually, yeah, I'm sorry for overrunning. But just a few points from yesterday when we looked at local and bottom-up planning. One of the things that we started off with saying that bottom-up is a very messy concept. It's a concept that implies a top and the bottom, and it implies some homogeneity at the bottom and at the top. But within what is perceived as a bottom, first of all, it's really we should consider this conception between up and down and top and bottom. But then at what is conceptualized as the bottom, of course, it's a very heterogeneous space. And of course, the so-called bottom is also full of resources that can be tapped on. Another kind of critical issue to start with was the concept of local. So local is, of course, if you look at it, if you perceive it through a multi-scalar lens, you can see it as a site, but you have to acknowledge the wider scales that play into localities. So we opened with questioning the concepts with which I actually want to work. That was quite exciting. And we reminded ourselves about the relation between people and institutions, and about the relation between resources and rights, and of course currently the discussion about the right to housing and the questions how this can be fulfilled or addressed. I remember from one of from a conference last year at which Sasha also was, there was a colleague from Amita Bida, a colleague from India, who questioned with some great illustrative examples from Mumbai, who questioned current projects which are brought forward under the label housing for all. And actually last year, when we discussed about the social dimension of social housing, and we looked at bordering practices around social housing in Vienna, we had a similar discussion. From this from this really critical opening, we then looked at case studies, and what both case studies did yesterday was to remind us that housing is not a commodity. Well, one element is that housing is produced these days very often as a commodity, but the case studies looked at housing as a process in which many actors are involved, as a process that is potentially empowering for those who are involved, and not only for those, in particular, if it is about co-producing and co-construction. We also looked in both case studies. We looked at a case study from Brazil and from Sao Paulo, and two from Vienna. They were really different, but by looking at these dynamics, they had some similarities, and we looked at community dynamics and questions of decision-making and power in them. And then a final point was that to understand, we were asking what do these specific projects that we look at tell us about the wider context. I don't share results. I can't share results with you at the moment. These are just kind of learning points or points for further consideration. But now we move to today's discussion, which is we start with infrastructure and then we move to design. And after this brief introduction, I'd like to introduce our panel and to ask each of you for a brief statement. And I just go about by the what I have here on WebEx. Yeah, now I see the list that I see is Sasha first, Sasha Rüssler, then Franton Piss, and then Roberta Coco. Is it fine for you to go about in this order?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, Sasha, do you want just to kick off?
Yeah, of course. So thank you so much for the invitation. It's a very interesting topic and also a relevant topic. I think this, let's say, social housing perspective related to climate issues. And so first of all, I would like to make a few remarks how the topic of urban climate is framed or considered today. And from my perspective, although the topic of urban climate is gaining more and more importance also in the public debates, the role of architecture and buildings and design in particular is pretty much unclear, I would say, or it's not really relevant in the current discussions. So most of the proposals related to urban climates are not architectural in a strict sense, I would say. They touch much more issues related to engineering, infrastructure in particular. And furthermore, I would like to remark that the current debates are coined by geographers, I would say, and technology writers rather than architects and architectural historians. So the discussion very much goes towards urban heat islands and then also the notion of mitigation. So, but if we look at the history of urban climatology, how it evolved at the beginning of the 20th century and its appropriation through the discipline of architecture, it becomes clear that this history was much richer, and beyond mitigation measures for fighting heat islands, the history was mainly centered around coping with urban climatic conditions. And so it was an issue about urban climates and how it can be used for climate control or climatization of interiors. So from my perspective as an architectural theorist and architect, urban climate raises important issues to reconsider our understanding of climate control. So it's not only about discussing comfort levels of outdoor areas, but rather the dialectics between inside and outside. So how can we also use architecture and develop architecture that really responds to the outside conditions and uses the outside condition for let's say, control and cope with the environments inside. So there's a certain research gap from my perspective, and the focus on architecture and urban climates offers an urban perspective on climate control. I think this is maybe my main point now for my opening remarks. And let me simply make few more remarks. So what is climate control in cities? It's not only about let's say certain structures such as building envelopes and building services, but there are always certain thermal regimes involved, such as building codes, standards, thermal standards, but also the thermal practices, of course, of the inhabitants or the users or the citizens. So how they move through the city over the course of the year, how they use their buildings or apartments and so on, what kind of clothes they would wearing. So all these aspects relate also to the question of an bottom-up approach in social housing and also to urban climate issues. And I fully agree that top-down and bottom-up is not a simply dichotomy. Rather, we should develop, as architects, for instance, and maybe also as social scientists, sophisticated approaches to the bottom-up approaches of inhabitants. And in our case, in our research, we developed a methodology that we call microclimate ethnography. So we try to describe with ethnographic means the microclimatic conditions, in particular in apartments, in social housing in different parts of the world. We are mainly focused on 4 cities: Cairo, Chongqing in China, Santiago de Chile, and Geneva. And so we try to kind of course, analyze the material culture and the construction of the building envelopes, but we also try to assess the thermal practices of the residents and their material culture of heating and cooling through home visits, through semi-structured interviews, and with these residents. So I think bottom-up approaches for architects should rely really on bold ethnographic insights, which are developed by experts at the end. Otherwise, we are simply kind of speculating, in particular as architects. Thank you.
Sorry, we had.
Sorry, we were.
Thank you very much for your remark, especially on the concept of climate control, and to bring in the idea that we have to learn from the practices of people, so to say, relate our work as architects or planners or whatever in the field of housing with ethnographic knowledge. Thank you very much. I think we continue.
Yeah. I was just wondering, can you hear Christoph, because he's sitting somewhere else in the room? Could you hear what he was saying?
We can, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Fran. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Very glad to join you this morning. Wish it was in real life, as we used to say. My comments really chime with Sasha's quite nicely, although I'm coming from an adjacent disciplinary perspective. I'm an urban sociologist, but one who works always in an interdisciplinary set of relationships with other social scientists, with architects, with urban designers, and with planners. My own disciplinary standing and my own analytical and critical take on all of this is a very simple one. That is always to work with an extended conception of design, both in terms of what design involves, but also in terms of who counts as a designer, who we think about as being involved in the work of design. That is to say that practices of design have to do with the design, obviously, of spaces and of physical forms, but also of policies, of processes, of organizations, of systems, of practices. And I think this is where this chimes with what Sasha was saying about these microethnographies of everyday climate life. And related to that, an extended conception of who we think about as engaged in practices of design. Who are the designers? We referred at the outset to the imbrication of formal and informal processes, and that's very relevant in that respect. So practices of design clearly involve expert, technical designers, architects, engineers, urban designers more broadly, but also policymakers, planners, indeed developers, but also downstream of those processes, one might say, residents, users, and everyday actors, engaging in formal technical informal and, we might say, amateur practices of design and adaptation. I like the term adaptation in this context. I know this is a very common one when we think about climate and climate challenges, but of course, adaptation is what people do with their spatial environments every day. Their housing environments, their working environments, their living environments. We are constantly involved in the micro practices of spatial adaptation to make our environments livable for us. My particular interest in the themes for the workshop and for today's papers, I enjoyed reading the papers and I look forward to hearing them fleshed out in more detail this morning, is to think about the issues and approaches that are being described there as social designs and as social technologies, as much as and at the same time as these are spatial designs and environmental technology. So always to embed the social. We know this is a complex term, but to always embed that in the environmental and spatial strategies with which we're concerned. I agree with Sasha about the emphasis there is on technological solutions and strategies, which are increasingly sophisticated. We don't know if they're increasingly adequate, but certainly technological approaches to climate adaptation and mitigation continue to advance. Changing social behavior and social forms can be more difficult. It's easier to work with things often than it is to work with bodies. So therefore, the fourth question that was set up at the beginning as framing the work of this workshop as a whole and the ongoing program of work of which it forms a part, that is, how do we design environments for living and for adaptive and climate conscious modes of practice is a very crucial one for me. And this extends also to my understanding of infrastructure. I know that Abdulmalik Simon was with you yesterday, and he, of course, is a key person in this work on the social life of infrastructure and the work of people as infrastructure, as he put it so eloquently, as carriers of infrastructure, as creators of infrastructure, as operators, and often as the raw material of urban infrastructures also. So I look forward to the discussion this morning. Thank you.
Concept of practices of design and to ask who is the in the complex understanding of this term. Thank you very much. And we move to Roberta.
Yeah.
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know if you're also already able to see my screen.
Wonderful.
Yes. I know. Oh.
So thank you very much for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be back in Vienna, although virtually.
Roberta?
But in this moment, I'm talking from Oslo. And yes, this is just a picture to let you know that sometimes climate mitigation is not such bad. Here in Oslo, this is the waterfront today. During the last summer, we had many days like that. And so this is on the another side of the coin in some way. Yes, I tried to do my homework for this in preparing this statement according to the suggestions of Simon and Crystal. And so I tried to answer to these basic questions. So what do we know from research so far? What are the emerging good and transversal practice, regional variation, and trade-off and obstacles? Just to start, I think we can tell that what do we know from research so far? We know that there are a lot of trade-offs and obstacles. I think we can answer like that. And I can answer like that from my perspective. My perspective of urban sociology much involved in urban political ecology studies, with a strong interest in understanding what are the social spatial implications of climate change adaptation in cities. What are the effects in terms of social spatial inequalities of a different distribution of environmental problems and goods also in cities. So this is my specific perspective here. A strong interest in social spatial inequalities as a fundamental dimension of sustainability. And what we know from the research so far, that we have a lot of trade-offs between climate adaptation and social spatial inequalities today, at least in many cities in Europe. And this is in part also due by the fact that a lot of these adaptations have been characterized by a very strong ecological modernization approach. The colleagues before me have already explained the huge stress, the huge implications of technology, of the technology innovations in relation to climate change. And if we try to focus on these adaptations in the field of housing, we clearly see some trade-offs. And the first one is a huge rebound effect, due also by a very weak participation of social participation and different difficulties in behavior adaptation to technologies. So we see a lot of rebound effects. But at the same time, also we can observe, and some colleagues working in investigation in urban political ecology also started to observe, of course, very interesting bottom-up experiences, more oriented to the grow approach, that show, of course, a higher participation and a lower rebound effect. But at the same time, with in some way similar social spatial implications for cities. First of all, in some parts of the cities, an increasing social homogeneity of these new areas, new projects, characterized by interesting and spectacular, sometimes, innovations in terms and infrastructures for climate change adaptation. And we observe also process of ecological gentrification in many areas of European cities due to the implementation of these new infrastructure for climate change adaptation. And when these innovations occur in the field of social housing, sometimes we can see also a sort of displacement pressure in the areas around these new projects and buildings. So to make things a little bit more concise, we can observe a lot of trade-offs between technological innovation for climate adaptation and the configuration of new social spatial inequalities in cities. This is clear in the debate about green gentrification. In blue, what is called also blue gentrification, water gentrification, what is going on in the areas around the waterfront, for example, of Scandinavian cities, but also cities in other parts of Europe. It's very emblematic. Climate change gentrification. This is a picture in Miami. The implication of on the housing market of climate change. But also we can observe some displacement pressure in the areas around areas of densification. For example, here in Oslo, there is a very huge stress, a huge focus on densification strategies in order to limit sprawl. But at the same time, we can see a very expensive housing market developing around these areas due to new infrastructures provided in these areas. And of course, the most important maybe aspect we can see, it's the increasing cost of the housing market in the buildings characterized by ecological retrofitting. Here there is a very huge literature developed, especially in Germany and also in Austria. I guess also Yuri Katzebov yesterday gave some information about a project on the effects of ecological retrofitting on housing market and so on. Very few words about emerging good and transversal practice and regional variations. Yes, here also the literature starting to highlight some good and transversal practices with a very strong regional variation. Again, I try to answer with the same question. And this variation depends on, of course, many aspects, context related, of course. First of all, what kind and if there is any coordination between housing policies and green planning strategies. If green planning strategies, for example, are associated with housing policies oriented to provide affordability in that area. And also it depends by housing policies that are able to scaling up with kind of very badly defined bottom-up innovations. But on the other side, I think this regional variation, not only in the European Union, depends also on a very different public awareness about what can be maybe the negative social implications of climate change adaptation on social and spatial inequalities. For example, in the United States, a very huge debate is developing around this concept of just green enough. The idea is that a public awareness in relation to the risk of ecological gentrification or displacement pressure is rising in many cities, and there is a lot of activism and new coalition that are trying to push for more inclusive policies and strategies, very often based on the idea that in order to deal with climate change, we have to provide less spectacular infrastructures and much more small-scale spread interventions. So this is my statement. Looking forward to hear more from you today. Bye.
Yeah, thank you, Roberta. It's important to include the inequality perspective in our discussion and the kind of political ecology. I find it very interesting, very helpful, and all these aspects of green, blue gentrification and the production of new production of inequality. And I think the papers today will give us opportunity to relate to all of your three statements. And thank you again, also Roberta, thank you. And I think we start with your paper on...
Yeah, so the first one would be Václav and Michaela, yes, from ANKA, which is a Czech environmental NGO, with a case study on Prague. And I suggest that we have two papers now. So we have the paper on Prague, and then we have Raoul with his paper about Indonesia afterwards, and then we take a break. And after the break, Fazia, if it's fine with you, we then have the case study on Rome, because then people have more, you know, they're a bit freshened up and can have better ears for your presentation, and then the final discussion. Okay, so we start with Prague, then move to Indonesia, and later on to Rome.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Anna. So, can everybody see the slides? Also, you guys online now, and can you hear me well? Yeah, I think so. Okay. So, thank you for the opportunity to be here on this very interesting and inspirational event. As said, me and Michaela, we are part of Arnica, which is Prague-based NGO focusing on different topics, and our part in this organization is to focus on the urban development of Prague. The nature of our work is basically watchdog activistic issues, and except of that, we are also academically involved. Me in at the Department of Sociology at Charles University, and Michaela at the Department of Social and Cultural Ecology at the same university. And we will bring to the discussion maybe a little bit different perspective of the post-socialist city. Of course, it's probably not necessary to repeat the whole context of what is happening regarding the climate change in the cities. But in the context of the post-socialist city, from our perspective, we think that the public discourse is still focused quite low on the problem of climate change, and of course there is this special context of the governance, which regarding to some authors who are focusing on post-communist. On post-communism, this neoliberal term after the revolution was maybe even sharper than in the 70s in the Western countries. So in this contribution, we would like to show kind of this different context of what the public discussion on climate change and adaptation and mitigation can look like. Also, the important goal of our presentation is that actually there may be many strategies which are actually created from this top-down perspective, but as in our context they don't have this binding nature, their application might be very problematic and may also depend a lot on the political will, and therefore the role of the civic engagement might be even more important.
All right, so a little bit to the context of social housing in the Czech Republic. So as Václav said, the situation is kind of specific for our environment because the so-called social housing policies in the post-socialist economies kind of still remain burdened by the decision making that was lacking some sort of concept in the past. So the process of the decentralization of power kind of led to the renewal of the regional self-government, and it included the transfer of the housing stock from the state to the municipal ownership. So the transfer, which was initiated in 1991, affected around 1.4 million flats, which is 39% of the housing stock in Czechia. The municipalities kind of became free to manage and allocate public housing according to their own preferences immediately after the housing stock transfer. So there's basically no state regulatory framework. Some of the municipal floods were privatized, some were rented out for market rent prices, and some were rented at below the market rent prices for people in housing needs. But for this case, the municipalities each adopted their own system. So yeah, the framework is basically non-existent. Yeah, so as I've said, the social housing as a conceptual practice doesn't exist in our context, but still there are over 80,000 people there in housing crisis. In our environment, it's more about the housing first projects in particular, for example, and then the social housing projects in general are still marginal and usually in the pilot phase. So there is basically no comprehensive assessment of the issue or its placement in the context of the climate crisis and other related design solutions. So there are some projects that start to appear, and they also may have a significant ecological dimension. As we know, solving social and climate problems at once is an effective way to use public resources. However, these projects are still, yeah, still in the very beginning, and that's it. As we both mentioned, the representatives kind of faced and ignored the diminishing options of the public housing and the rise of homelessness for quite a long time. At the moment, the city of Prague seems to, maybe even thanks to the pandemic, realize that a lot needs to be done, but there are some steps, as we mentioned here, but they're not really reassuring or conceptual.
And maybe one little remark regarding to literature for David Madden and Peter Marcus, who wrote this quite well-known book in defense of housing. The housing policies used to be, or maybe they are still with the ongoing neoliberal politics, some kind of instrument of private benefits, of the benefits of the private development. So they see actually the housing policies very skeptical. And from our point of view, this kind of new discussion on public housing in Prague is problematic in this way, as the post-socialist context and actually the tradition of the governance in the Czech capital was very private oriented until this time. So, and maybe another remark from Ralph Dahrendorf, who actually thinks that the societal transformation from one system to another may take over 60 years. So, regarding to this, we, like the Czech Republic, may be now in the half of the transformation process from the socialist era to maybe some kind of participative democracy. So, this may be still very long process. So coming to our case studies, we created last year a set of some concrete cases of Prague localities or locations with different problems, and actually also with different examples of positive practice regarding to climate adaptation. There was a very broad scale of measures, and we won't be able to actually describe all of them during this presentation, but we try to describe them in our paper, which is on the web application of the IBA. So we will try to go through them very briefly, and if you are interested in more detail, you can have a look in that paper.
I would just give it a perspective, like the climate strategy-wise. The Czech Republic has, of course, also adopted some strategic and action documents, but most of them were not ours, but it was the European Union regulation. And when we look at the principles that are suggested in the forthcoming legislation, they're not bad, but the real implementation of the principles is not only speculative, but often the new legislation goes directly against these principles. so the capital city kind of prepared their own climate change adaptation strategy, which is good, but the implementation into the day-to-day life in the city appears to be very problematic. The document is very good quality, but it has not so far been demanded enough, and it's been not appropriately written into the truly binding regulations such as spatial planning and construction legislation. So at the moment, it's the private investors who only rarely follow the principles of adaptation of the energy efficient buildings and so on and so on. Yeah, so that would be the principal issue, and not only for the Prague authorities, but also for other Czech cities. Back to the case studies. So as you can see, or you might have read in the paper, the studies have kind of popularizing and educative character. So we present specific cases of measures from the Czech Republic, which might be maybe common in context of Austrian or German practice, but are quite progressive in the post-socialist context. Yeah, so we draw from a qualitative study of documents and of specific measures in the field, and we conduct interviews in the different with the different players involved in the field. So that would be local government representatives, citizens, and the investors usually.
So the first two case studies were focused on the problems that the socialist housing estates are facing now in the context of climate change adaptation and mitigation. But those estates that we were examining, which was Prague 12, which is actually the city district, and the exact estate is the neighborhood of Kamík. And we also, the other case study is focused on Sídliště Ďáblice. So there are some similarities in what both the local people and the local municipalities are dealing with, and there are some differences. As you know, the socialist housing estates are maybe not that dense as the inner city blocks, like the classical older blocks, but still, also because of the construction technologies, there are many adaptation difficulties. On the other hand, on these kind of housing estates, there are big public spaces with big adaptation potential. There is a lot of greenery. There are public playgrounds and stuff like that, which actually can help with some kind of revitalization, help adapt these localities more to the consequences of the climate change. In the context of the growth of prices for housing in Prague, which is really huge, like for example in 2017 in the Czech Republic, the prices were growing the most in the European Union, and Prague is actually on top of this process. So actually these kind of housing estates, these coming from the socialist era, are now quite popular, not only because of the prices, but also because of these public spaces and in the means of transportation services and stuff like that. Yeah. So going more into the detail, in the Kamík estate, we did interview with the local municipality and local experts actually working at the local town hall, and they focused because of the problems with the ownerships directly in the houses. They focused on maintenance of the public spaces. So they focused on high quality greenery care, well-planned mowing, and so also they try to keep the high-grown grass in specific areas where it was possible. They actually settled a meadow with different kind of flowers. They also grazed in some areas, and they also try to engage the community. For example, they created many do-it-yourself composts, and the community actually took care on the composting. They also try to start the water recyclation and retention on public spaces into water tanks. In Sídliště Ďáblice, the problem was different because there is a problem of the further development conception. There are big investment interests, and so therefore the Prague Institute of Planning and Development, which is organization established by the city to deal with those urban planning expert things, they created new spatial study which should have regulate this further construction. But this construction was very dense, very massive, and in terms of adaptation, this whole estate was very well adapted because of a lot of greenery, a lot of growth trees. And so the problem was actually the opposite, that the spatial study actually proposed a worsening of the situation. And so there was a big civic activity regarding this problem. The locals started a petition and public mobilization. The petition was signed by about 7,000 people. But what we involved this case because of the risk that even a conceptual study might be very problematic regarding climate adaptation issues. The fifth case in our paper is also focused on spatial study, and we want to show also that in this exact study, the adaptation issues might be very problematic. I will show it on the pictures. So this is the Kamík district. On the upper pictures, you can see the state of the meadow before and after the realization. You can see this very easy and simple compost. They created tens of them in the neighborhood, and on the lower picture on the right, there is the deputy mayor with one of the water tanks they installed there. And this is the Sídliště Ďáblice estate. On the upper left picture, you can see actually the proposal of the spatial study done by the city magistrate or by the Institute of Urban Planning and Development. And so the red ones are these proposed buildings. So actually the estate should basically double its size. On the right picture, you can see a belt of isolation greenery, which actually separates the estate from big communication. And so this isolation greenery was also endangered because of this spatial study. Now the spatial study went through public commenting, and we will see what will actually happen, how it will be improved. And so this is the other study for Prague Dubny. This is the biggest brownfield in Prague. And although this spatial study may seem that it takes a lot of care on the adaptation, you can see there might be some green yards with the growth terrain, but still it's just very few of them. And the traffic solutions are very problematic because it's also focused a lot on individual car traffic, and the density of the construction is very high.
All right. So in another study, we focused on the courtyards for many reasons. The original part of the center of Prague consists basically of lots of buildings, and people used to use them a lot, the courtyards, but there are areas with a huge potential for the implementation of green and blue measures, but so far this opportunity hasn't been seized yet in larger scale in Prague. These adaptation measures in courts and corridors are actually very cheap, and in case of the green measures, it consists basically of greening, like adding plants and the greenery maintenance, and that be it. I'm not sure how we're doing time-wise. Okay. So we chose 2 courtyards. They were both in a kind of different situation. One of them was a bit smaller, and it was like they had this very small rent from the town hall and a tiny grant. I think there were less communication difficulties because it was less subjects sharing the area. And they were like very dedicated individuals, but so what they did was, yeah, they put like several like garden beds that they took care of, and a water tank and so on. The thing is that after some time kind of got difficult to communicate with each other, and the outcome would be that probably the local authorities should work on creating like instruction manuals, as well as like other motivational tools for people in the localities, while also expanding the grant opportunities with the courtyards. Because with the other courtyard that we studied, there were very many subjects owning the place, so it came to this like communication clash. They worked together with this organization called VNO that's really focused on revitalizing the courtyards, and they kind of facilitate the whole process from the very beginning with all the neighbors and so on. But the very bad experience is that once they leave the place, sometimes it just comes crashing, so it goes back to the local authorities to kind of manage this process better. If you want to add something.
I'm not sure, probably not.
Yeah, the last thing I would like to mention is the on-site activities that Annika as an organization does at the moment. So what we're focusing now, and I think works really well, is to actually organize this critical commented city walks. So it's usually in cooperation with architects or urban planners that prepare this like commented walk through the city, and we actually stop at the problematic sites according to the huge business developments and stuff like that, and on the spot proposing what might probably the better solutions be and so on. And at the end, there's always a discussion with the participants, and there are also some like local politicians attending and so on. So that's very interesting. And then we are participating in organization of this festival for sustainable and neighborly Prague that's taking place next weekend, which is also focused on the gentrification, the development, the climate crisis in the city, and on the cooperation with the different individuals and the civic initiatives and so on. So.
Okay, so to conclude very briefly, we are aware that we run through the case studies. So if you are interested in any particular case, you can have a look to the paper, or you can ask us. But what we wanted to show that the problem of the post-socialist situation or the post-socialist city is that there are no systemic solutions of social or any actually affordable housing. There are only minor projects and pilots. The blue and green infrastructure is done mainly by local governments and also in specific cases and the local citizens. And the support from municipal institutions is very low. And actually, the application of the strategic documents is binded to political will, which is low as well. Therefore, one of the solutions we think is necessary, because of all the negotiation climate in Prague, that those strategies need to be actually transformed into binding rules, such as spatial plan, such as the building code, and so on. So yeah, thank you for attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for the first presentation on Prague, and we're all looking at Prague these days and years because of the political changes we had over the last years, and we all work with some hope at Prague. So there would be much to discuss, in particular as in the title you presented, there would be actually space for maneuver, but somehow you seem to be skeptical about still about what's going on. But we're now moving somewhere totally different. We're moving to Bogor, to Indonesia, and we welcome Raul. Can you hear me, Raul?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Wonderful. Do you want to? Can you share your screen with us?
Sure, I will share my presentation. Just 1 second.
Okay. And as I said earlier, so we now have the second case study, and I think after this we already have some good contrast, but then after your presentation, we'll take a break. After then, last year's presentation on role, and then. But now, Raul, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, and Technical University in Vienna, and for the panel for comments in the beginning. I couldn't attend to yesterday's opening of the event, but I heard the sort of notes that the speaker gave in the introduction. So I think that we are pretty much in the same state of mind regarding all the issues related to social housing, community, and climate change, and so on. So what I'm going to present here now, I'm going to present it from a sort of a very different context than the European context, with very different challenges, but of course, we are all impacted by the same climate change risk associated with everything that is happening in the city. So I'm going to present today a project that was involved a couple of years ago while I was working in Monash University. It was a project, international cooperation project between Australia and Indonesia, to sort of support Indonesian cities to make their transition, or to sort of accelerate the transition towards more sustainable and friendly water states in the city. So my presentation today is going to be around the integration of green infrastructure in social housing and informal settlements upgrading, and specifically sort of the bottom-up participatory revitalization strategy that we have in our case studies in the city of Bogor, Indonesia. About my background, I'm an architect and an urban designer, so I'm going to show pretty much more design-based sort of results to this, but of course I also want to talk a little bit about the process, especially the participatory process that we have in this project. Well, just yeah. So I'm going to talk first about the introduction of this water sensitive city concept. I think perhaps some of you are already familiar with this framework that has been developed in Australia and also some other countries in Europe as well. And a little bit about green infrastructure in public space. I'm going to focus for this presentation more, green infrastructure and in public space, and I'm going to explain why a little bit further, and then I'm going to present one of our case studies called Kunulis, and sort of the co-design and revitalization approach, and a little bit of our finding and recommendations for how to make these upgrading processes. So let me just dive into the context. So this is the city of Jakarta. I don't know if you are familiar with the city or have the opportunity to visit. It's the second largest metropolis in the world, almost 30 million inhabitants in Jakarta, with large problems related to climate change, especially around floods. As you can see, this is one of the central areas in Jakarta, and this is very usual phenomena every year. They have this sort of large floodings, and as well, the city is also sinking as well because of the extraction of underground water. So they have a lot of problems related to this, and of course the idea of the project, of the cooperation project, was sort of trying to support the cities and how to tackle with these issues. And of course, I mean, the problem with water is that it's not only when it's not well managed it become a nuisance. It's also that sometimes even if we have areas that are flooded, we don't have water to access to water supply, right? So it is something very a contrast that is very sort of weird, that we have so much water, but at the same time there is not enough water for drinking supplies and from other kind of uses. So the idea was to change this and to consider all that is related to the water cycle city and try to understand better how to interact within them. But of course, this is not only a phenomena of developing countries. Of course, this is the city of Melbourne. I don't know if you are familiar or have visited the city. This is Flinders Station, which is the main train station in Melbourne. So in Melbourne, we also have this kind of phenomena, right? These floodings because of alterations of climate change patterns, and that's the reason why Australia has been working really hard in trying to tackle this issue. And it is not only from the excess of water, but it's also related to the access of, or absence of water, or the elevation of temperatures that create large problems for Australia. As you can see, the last year we have one of the worst bushfire seasons in recent history, where sadly millions of hectares of Australia were burned, a great loss of animal life, and so on. So these are the main sort of drivers that motivated Australia to sort of tackle into this and trying to address this within a framework in planning. Well, I want to sort of start talking about the scale of urban design and the importance of urban design for active community life. In the presentations, it has been said that it's very important for human interaction, of course, and there is also some qualities in urban space that we want to preserve, that we want to promote. Of course, there is all kind of urban design, from the very good examples and that are inclusive and participatory to the very bad top-down examples of urban design in many cities. But the idea is to sort of use the public space, or take the advantage of the public space, not only as a recreational area, but also to have another function. So multifunctional uses of public space. And the idea is to use it as a platform for environmental recovery. Again, most of the times, public space is only considered for these sort of recreational uses or for interaction, but it can be much more. It can be a way to recover cities' ecosystems. It can be a way to improve the water cycle in cities. And of course, if the process are done within a participatory framework, as it has been proposed also by some of the mentions in the lecture, so the more the better, right? So this is the idea, to try to change and the way that this is conceived or designed. Many examples, of course. This is, I guess, one of the more familiar to in Europe. This is Bettelheim Square in Rotterdam. I don't know if some of you are familiar with this example. It was designed by the studio in the Netherlands called the Urbanisten. It has been a very successful example of urban design from the adaptation point of view, as this space kind of mutates during different seasons, and when is the rain season, so you have a different configuration. When is the dry season is different, and it's the same as winter. So the same space sort of interact and is adaptable to different conditions. So we find this very interesting. We want to sort of apply these concepts as well, and how to integrate this adaptation into the design of public space. Now, talking about what is the water sensitive design framework, what the framework is based on is to understand sort of the water transition, urban water transitions in cities, from sort of very basic stages of development, a city that is only doing the supply of the water or the sewer water, to progressively more advanced states of development until finally achieving a city that is, let's call it water sensitive, right? So the idea is to sort of how to promote this transition to make it in a sustainable way, and in contexts where these different stages can be accelerated to avoid undesirable stages of the transition. So we sort of try to apply this leapfrogging key to try to accelerate this process. So in the idea that we have project, it was to sort of jump from very basic states of cities in Indonesia, that is cities that are only cover water supply and sewerage, to try to accelerate the transition towards more sensitive urban areas in Australia and as well in Indonesia. And what the framework is about, of course, to recovering the natural balance in urban areas. I mean, when the area is natural, I mean, without urbanization, so there is a precipitation and infiltration and evapotranspiration and so on, all these important processes for water cycles. But what happened when we built the city, and we built the city in a way that is not considering the water cycle of the city, is that we reduce infiltration, and then we transform completely what's happening in the cities. So what the framework is trying to do is to try to understand and to make it a more circular process, where we reuse, for example, wastewater, when we also reuse the stormwater and reduce the storm runoff, and trying to address this again from the design point of view. So from the water sensitive cities, of course, the water sensitive urban design is based on as a sort of, again, an alternative to minimize environmental degradation and improve aesthetic and recreational appeal of cities, and changing the paradigm a little bit of considering the cities, instead of being water drainers or just consuming water, the cities become part of the water supply process, or part of the catchment, right? So cities and all the rainwater that fall in cities, it can become also a way of provision of different sources of water in cities. So that's one of the main ideas, to change the paradigm towards the city as a water supply catchment. There are also a lot of concepts related to these, such as sponge cities that are being developed in China and so on, right? Considering and focusing on water and water cycles to understand better. And of course, to support ecosystem services, to promote and to support everything that is happening around these important ecosystem services to the cities, from ecological and economical benefits, and of course communities that are involved in the process. So the water sensitive city without the communities, or water sensitive communities, is really not working. The idea is everything has to work together in order to be a real change. And from the water sensitive framework, there are different dimensions, of course, from function, control of water quality, from amenity, water quantity, and water supply. So all of these sort of dimensions are combined, and not only with different disciplines, of course, not only urban design, but also with hydrologists, with sociologists, with water engineers, with all sort of professionals that collaborate together into making an integrated framework. And of course, applying all the green infrastructure tools that have been named already here in the last presentation. There were some mentions of rain gardens and rainwater tanks, right? So also from wetlands and bioswales and all these sort of different tools that kind of again support to improve the water cycle in cities. And this was developed, the framework was developed as a part of a research cooperational project funded by the Australian government that is called the CRC for Water Sensitive City, or Collaborative Research Center for Water Sensitive Cities. And the four main pillars of this was influence policy as well, because without really sort of getting into the policy, it's not something real change that we can do. Again, engaging communities in the process, designing water-sensitive cities, and benchmarking and decision-making, which is a part of the process to support that other cities as well are integrated in the process and can evaluate as well the process they're having. And there are a lot of things related to this that can be found as well in different places. And there are sort of adoption for this water sensitive framework. There are some incentives for doing it, for example, from development rights, tax cuts or accreditation. I mean, the framework is not mandatory still in Australia, but it's sort of, there are some incentives that the government is offering for local governments to include it. And now I'm going to talk about our case study in Jakarta, or the city of Bogor. Again, the city of Jakarta, it's a huge metropolis, what they call it Jabodetabek, which is the junction of many municipalities that are around Jakarta. And Bogor specifically is 1 hour from there, located in the island of Java. The island of Java itself having 120 million inhabitants only in the island. So you can imagine the amount of stress and pressure that this puts into the environmental systems, right? You have to provide for 120 million inhabitants in just one island. And of course, in the scale of the city, this sort of creates additional challenges in water supply, water treatment, and everything that is related to these cycles. So the pilot study that I wanted to present now, one of our case studies, it was in this area called Punagulis, an area with a very interesting urban setting, which is an island located in one urban river that is called the Chilibun River in Bogor. And the idea was to support this sort of participatory process for the implementation of the upgrading of the green technology. I'm going to show very quickly some of the process that we have here, because I know that we have very few time, but there's information about it in the paper and other links as well. Well, again, the context of the island, and this is the sort of the area of the project, an island of 3 hectares with a population of 2,600 inhabitants. The island have in the beginning some sort of social housing that was transformed into or integrated around an informal settlement. So regional social housing is no longer sort of you can no longer distinguish the difference between the original social housing and the other houses that were built in the process, and that is the way that most of these informal areas in cities are evolving. And of course, many issues related to water, especially water pollution, because most of the houses don't have water treatment for wastewater, so the water is thrown into the river directly. And there's also lack of access to water supply, limited accessibility, erosion from the river, and other sort of issues related to economical disadvantage of the area. So what we wanted to do is, with this sort of participatory process, it was to first understand the conditions of the island, working together with the community. I'm going to describe very quickly these steps of the process. First, what we call a visioning FGD, or visioning focus group discussion, where we have different tools as community mapping, problem solution trees, and so on, trying to collect from the community what were the main issues, what are the ideas for the transformation, what they're expecting, what is their vision for the future, right? And try to build on that vision for the community in our project. After that, as the area didn't have any sort of physical or information on maps or plans, we have to sort of make the whole measurement of the area in a sort of more in a different way. So with a mapping, mapping of the area, creating a digital elevation model that it was neat to make all the calculations for our design. It was later post-processed in 3D, and of course the hydrological model to support all the interventions in the island. After this, we have a series of urban design scenarios where we're showing different scenarios for the island together with the community, discussing these scenarios, which scenarios can be more suitable for them, better for them in terms of their own development, and follow up with a series of interviews and surveys, and finally an urban design workshop where we came back to them and discussed the final designs, refined the final designs with them in order to incorporate the feedback from the very beginning to the very last part of the process. So this is one of the main things that I think that it was good in this project. It was the process was done from the very beginning to sort of the last conception design together with the community, learning from the experience, because of course they know better the areas, and taking advantage of the social capital that is already built in the island to sort of promote or make their own recovery. And our urban design approach was based on an integrated approach where we were providing the necessary infrastructure to improve community health, environment, and while we were upgrading the public space network. Well, one of the things I forgot to mention that there were almost no public space in the area. I mean, it was so crowded and so dense that there's no public space. So we needed to create some public space out of nothing. It was very challenging in this concept, right? So we tried to see different alternatives and try how to create or how to recover the public space in which we can make our interventions. And the second one, it was adaptability, thinking about future changes related to climate change and population growth with spaces and green infrastructure that is adaptable and flexible. And again, co-develop with community and holders for a better chance of success, of course, of the project involving the community. And this was translated into the series of urban design concepts, from intensification of the greenery using green infrastructure tools, also vertical farming and greenery, and treatment of black water, gray water, and stormwater, mostly with constructed wetlands that were cleaning the wastewater before it was sort of thrown into the river or reused into the same households. And of course, creating a new network public space in the city to improve livability and access to sunlight and ventilation that was needed in the area. So we come up with different alternatives on how to mix all these concepts. We created this sort of matrix, or multifunctional public spaces matrix, where we have different layers. From the first layer, a layer of activities such as play, exercise, and leisure. Second layer of elements, furniture, shading, lighting, and so on. And a third layer of green technologies, right? So different sort of green technologies that we can interact, we can apply in the area. So within this this matrix, we created sort of different combinations of the spaces, and we selected three sort of pilot projects to apply this all these sort of combinations. I'm just going to show very quickly some of them. So this was one of the main spaces, or the only sort of open space in the island, which was not public. It was just an empty sort of plot of land, but it was not public. So the idea it was to sort of acquire this piece of land with the community, with the help of the government and funding, and transform this open piece of land into something that is actually improving the living conditions from the people in the island. So in here we can see all the different green infrastructure tools that we apply, focusing on solving the main issues of water pollution, how to make the treatment of the water, as we were mentioning, using constructed wetlands the water, of course, collecting the water, rainwater, and treating the rainwater with biofilters and other sort of technologies to make the water sort of reusable, perhaps not for drinking purposes, but for other sort of purposes that they can be used in the island. And of course, we understood that this is a process that takes many phases in order to be implemented. So we try to plan sort of the short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals or projections on how to understand this infrastructure as a scalable infrastructure. So starting with the pilot projects and sort of building on that and try to scale up the projects along the years, right? So, and of course, covering a larger percentage of the island. And this was the proposal for this implementation, and how to be able to address in 1 to 5 years the process of recovery, environmental and social recovery of the area. And finally, some recommendations for this adoption from our experience. We found a lot of sort of regulatory framework barriers and institutional fragmentation at state and local governments. So first, it was not very clear about which regulatory frameworks we needed to obey in order to apply this technology. So it's very important that this regulatory framework is clear, of course, inserted into the local policy, and of course a little bit of coordination between local and federal governments, and which responsibility is who on how to act in these different places. Another sort of thing we notice is the assessment of costing uncertainties related to selecting and optimizing these water-sensitive urban practices, because there is not a lot of research related to, for example, cost-benefit relationship between these. So if we build it, what is the real benefit for community? Difficult to establish, again, because there haven't been a lot of research, especially in this context in developing countries, on all these issues. So it's very important to sort of focus a little bit more research on this cost benefit and business case, making the business case in order to develop this technology. Marketing, again, and acceptance of certain related uncertainties in the project was also one of the issues. And identifying best practices, I think, is always important. We learn a lot from different experiences, from different projects related to this, especially one of the largest projects being developed now in Asia that is called the RISE project, Revitalization of Informal Settlements and Their Environments, that is funded by the Asian Development Bank and the Wellcome Trust. And they're just sort of using this green technology to improve informal settlements in Indonesia and in Fiji, which are the sort of the first countries selected to develop. So we learn a lot from this. So it's very important to sort of look at what other people are doing, to learn from their mistakes, and also to sort of share the information that you have related to this. And finally, in terms of the whole participatory urban design project process, as I mentioned earlier, to involve the communities early in the process of upgrading from design to implementation, I think is one of the keys, and taking advantage as well of making a decentralized water in order to have a more resilient city and not cities that are depending on just one main and very rigid structure water system supply and treatment, but instead of that, working into decentralized water systems, right? So areas can actually provide some of their own water. Some areas of the city can treat some part of their own water, and this, of course, is much better in order to be resilient to a lot of these different challenges. And also the training of facilitators to support the process and delivering the community workshops and follow-up activities, very important. We call it water champions, that were these people that were promoting into the community and sort of championing the whole process and sort of being the link with the community. So I think it's important to train them. It's very important to consider them in the process because they are actually one of the key factors of success. Yeah, so I think it's mostly the thing I wanted to say. I don't know how I'm running on time, but yeah, I think I will just leave it there for now. I mean, this final is the sort of the exhibition that we did at the project in Bogor, when we invited the members of the community to see the final results of the designs that were discussed and co-designed with them. And the second part of the project, it was, of course, the construction, and the government of Indonesia, it was sort of committed to funding the project, and construction was set to start early this year. But of course, the whole sort of COVID virus thing came over, and all these projects are currently on hold. But we hope that pretty soon we can actually move to the second phase of this and start construction of the projects and see actually the transformation being done. And if you want more information about all these processes, especially with water-sensitive cities, there is a very well sort of structured site where you can find all the sort of technical reports for this process for the CRC of water-sensitive cities in Australia. And I think I'm just going to leave there. So thank you very much for the information. If you want more information about this, you can always visit our webpage or contact me, and I will be happy to share more information. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Raul. Thank you very much, Navi.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. The second part of our session, we had two case studies from Prague and Bogor. And now we have one more case study presented by Vasya Pakaki about recent practices in Rome. And after your presentation, we're then going to have a discussion or comparative discussion about the three cases. Okay, so Vasya, the floor is yours.
Okay, I need to share my screen. Okay. Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay, so hello also from me. Thank you for the opportunity you gave me to be here today, even if unfortunately I cannot be there physically. And I hope you enjoy also the next site visit and the rest of the conference day. My name is Vasya. I am an architect and an urban planner. And the topic of today's presentation is part of my master thesis. So it's basically a project proposed by me. It's not materialized, and it's contextualized in the city of Rome in Italy. So some initial data. Italy, as other countries, has signed several environmental agreements, and it's committed to follow the agenda of 2030. The basic 2 points are the mitigation and the reduction of carbon dioxide emissions, and also the adaptation by the limitation of environmental systems vulnerability, and that means creating more resilient places in the city. Rome precisely is under the global network of C40 cities. So here you can see some data, the emissions of the city, and unfortunately, most of the part of them, the 60% of them, is made by the buildings. And this is because usually the stock of Rome is, the housing stock of Rome is really old. And there are few initiatives so far to retrofitting the buildings or reconstruct them in a more environmental sufficient way. Regarding the buildings, here you can see that the influence of the municipality is, of course, more regarding the public buildings, but much less regarding the private buildings. And the social housing in Italy, unfortunately, it doesn't really work after the boom, let's say, of the 50s and 60s. And so you see that in the whole Italy, the public rental housing of the total housing units is only 3%. And in Rome, especially, the private ownership of houses is 75%. So there are few people that rent and they don't own their houses. Also, we have a really a high raise of the rents, especially after the crisis of 2010. This number is for the whole Europe, but in the city of Rome, the rents have been risen over 50% during the last 5 years. So they create basically a really hectic way of life for the people. And this is where my project proposal responds by proposing an alternative shared living model that is based on social housing and co-housing typologies, and in order to save up energy and living costs and promote also a more social everyday life, community support and social interaction among its tenants. Quickly, I will just read you the design principles. So the design should guarantee minimum requirements of land cover and materials. It should propose an adequate flexibility regarding size and location. And it is expected to produce a new community living concept that is based on community sharing principles. In addition, it should promote the principles of eco-design and sustainable architecture. So to introduce you a bit in the urban context, the project area is in the San Lorenzo neighborhood, which is really close to the historical center and just 10 minutes walking by the central train station, the Termini. The neighborhood is a mixed-use one, since we have the university campus of Sapienza on the north side of the project area, while the rest of the neighborhood is a mixed use of residents, of shops, and public administration buildings. It is a really good connected area by means of transport, since it's close to the historical center and the train station. And regarding the urban green, we see that there are sufficient, let's say, green spaces, but not really big regarding the the surface of them. And the dots represent the communal orchards or the community gardens, which is, unfortunately, I don't have the map here, but I can share you a link in the chat. It's one of the main elements that inspired my project, because hopefully the city of Rome in the last years has adopted this mentality of creating a lot of community gardens and urban orchards. Some of them are formal, some of them are informal, some of them are occupied spaces, private initiatives or public initiatives. So it's a lot of, let's say, gardening culture in this city. Here you can see the methodology of my project. These are the user types that I considered when designing. So we are talking about an affordable way of living. So basically families that are new families and couples that are trying to make ends meet, nuclear families or elder people that are alone, people with special needs, or students and people that travel a lot because of working motives. The dwelling concept is the main one. Let's say the principal elements of the whole project, because I wanted to minimize the private space in order to give more space for the collective and shared functions, and in this way create an adaptable and flexible space for the needs of every user. Here you can see the project area and the concept of the massing concept of my building. Okay, and here is a zoomed view. So I decided to dedicate most of the lot space to green infrastructure. So basically we have two separate buildings. This bar-shaped one is hosting all the private units and the shared spaces like the laundry. We have here a small library and kitchens, and this is a projection space. And then we have the long green living room, or the patio, that I'm going to show you further on. And here is the co-working space, which is can be used by the residents and also by people from the neighborhood. And here we have the gardens of the project area, while the rest of it is dedicated to urban gardening, urban orchards. There is also a place for bicycle parking, and this is only a temporary car parking because I wanted also to promote the sustainable alternative mobility in the city. And here we have the storages for the equipment for the gardening. And here you can see three greenhouses that can be also used as events hall or organizing other kind of activities by the tenants. This diagram shows also the spatial zones that represent also the thermal zones. It's a compact design that allows to manage better also the thermal gains and the thermal losses of the building. And here you can see the plans of the various floors. It's a four floors building. So as I said before, here it's visible all the dwellings, the private units, and in green there are always the humid zones, so the bathrooms that are aligned in order to save up also space, and they are oriented to the coldest parts, let's say, of the building. And here you can see the views of the collective spaces. So basically we have always the private dwellings aligned here, then there is the connecting corridor with the bridges that bring you to the three collective shared spaces, which is the kitchen always in the middle, and the other two sides there are the living rooms or playrooms or free spaces for the tenants. And here you can see an east view. There is a glass facade that allows illumination of the corridors, a natural illumination of the corridors. And here you can see also the view from the terrace of the co-working space towards the gardens and the urban orchards, and the view of the 3 greenhouses. Here there is another view, and the west facade. It's totally covered of terracotta tiles in order to use natural material. It's also ventilated, so it protects the private dwellings from heat and cold, depending on the season. And here is another view from the inside of the gardens and the urban orchards. So regarding the structure, I just show here a small detail, architectural detail. The structure, the frame is of recycled steel, and there are several prefabricated components that are totally recyclable and reusable also. On the building of the bar-shaped building, there is also the green roof that is used also to there are installed also solar panels in order to use the energy, and the green roof also helps the retention of rainwater. Here you can see that green living room that I told you. It's the patio. It's on the ground floor, and all this opening creates an open space and relation also to the outdoor space, and brings in natural ventilation and cross ventilation, and also natural light. You can see the view of the co-working space. Now, regarding the principles, I just mentioned some of them. We have compact forms of all buildings in order to reduce the energy losses, and also a really good insulation in order to reduce the thermal bridges. The patio also is used for natural ventilation and illumination. There is the natural ventilated facade, and those galleries also allow the flow of the air and give the opportunity of shaded outdoor space for the users. Regarding the green roof, it increases the thermal inertia, it filters the rainwater, and it enhances the microclimate, the local microclimate, and also it reduces the urban heat island effect that in Rome, unfortunately, as in many big metropolitan cities, this is a really present effect. And here there is a diagram describing the environmental strategy of my design. So you can see again that the roof is used also to collect the rainwater, and then by several tubes we treat it and use it also for irrigation of the urban orchards. At the same time, there is a grey water treatment and reused for the showers or for the washing machines. And the orientation, of course, of the building is considered in a way that the more collective spaces are facing to the southeast, so we have more illumination, and on the other hand, the private dwellings are facing the northwest, and also these openings between the building volumes, they allow the better flow of the air and the better ventilation of the whole building. So basically, the idea was to minimize the living costs and saving up energy, not just by adopting several environmental design principles and technologies, but also by trying to arrange the spaces in a way that allows us to have a more efficient and better functioning plan of the spaces. That is for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Vasya. Now we have quite a challenge ahead of us. We have three very, very different cases, each of which really interesting, exciting. And at least I wrote down many questions and issues that I'd like to explore deeper, but I need to shut up because we have much more distinguished people around the panel who should discuss and question what they have just heard. Roberta, Sasha, and Fran, who would like to break the ice? Okay. Yep. Sasha, it looks like you're ready to comment.
Yeah, I can try to start. So yeah, thank you so much. It was really super interesting to follow these three very different presentations, and maybe to start with, what I was kind of intrigued in particular in the first presentation was were two things. On the one hand, in Prague, there was also of course, the legacy of the socialist housing, and in a certain way, it was very interesting to hear that this model, which seemed to be outdated now for decades, seemed to be maybe regaining a certain importance also as an urban model, since it offers a lot of green space, for instance, and it can be also taken for the further development, let's say, of the city. And the second aspect I would like to mention are the courtyards, which are also a really interesting architectural element. I think also forming kind of an interface between inside and outside in a certain way. So offering a private space for the inhabitants, and also relating, of course, to the cooling capacities of an urban environment. So I think but furthermore, I also think the courtyard, as you would encounter in Central Europe, in many cities, in Prague, but also in Bucharest, and then in Vienna also, I think it also raises questions about historical legacy and how we would kind of transform this legacy and also relate to this architectural heritage when it comes to climate adaptation, etc. So I think this is one aspect which seems for me important, and which is maybe in a certain way in contrast to at least to the second presentation in Indonesia, which seems to be, although it relies on participatory planning, etc., it's nevertheless, of course, an approach very much triggered by engineering skills, let's say. So what is in this case, for example, what are the architectural elements, the traditional architectural elements, which are developed further? That would be maybe a question. How's the relation between the architectural heritage and the future city, so to speak? Maybe that's a first comment and question.
Okay, thank you, Sasha. Roberta, would you like to continue?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for these interesting presentations. I have few comments and few questions for each of you, actually. Again, you have already understood what is my main interest in researching mitigation strategies and housing. So also my questions will be characterized by this interest, and I'm sorry for this, a bit repetitive anyway. For the first presentation, was really interesting to see, and I was wondering if you had any chance to compare this case study to other more or less, not always, of course, similar case studies in former socialist countries. I'm not an expert on this, but for example, I can remember some interesting investigations by Annegret Hase, for example, in Leipzig, actually, investigating how greening the social housing and some green infrastructures became also a driver of new attractivity and new growth for these cities. I understand that the case of Prague is different. Prague, it's completely different context, but I was wondering if you can tell more, if you know if there is literature or you know anything about other case studies about this process in former socialist countries. Instead, the second presentation actually was really different, but also very much interesting. My main interest is in understanding what are the criteria you use to define the what kind of criteria have been used to identify the areas of the cities that may be affected by this kind of intervention. And especially, I'm quite interested in understanding what was the focus, what are the criteria in terms of social context. So, what kind of tools have you used to understand better the social context of these interventions? And in your opinion, if there have been any implications in terms of changes of the social composition of the areas or something related to this. In general, I'm interested in understanding in this strategy water sensitive cities, how the social composition of the population is taken into account while promoting this kind of interventions. And finally, the last presentation, also very interesting. I'm not an architect, but I was wondering what you were presenting. Also here, aspects related to the affordability, the accessibility in terms of inhabitants, prospective inhabitants. And also, if you are able to tell also something in relation to the possible interaction between this project and the neighborhood, the social context around it, because I think it's always important to take into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your presentations this morning. They were very different papers in very different contexts, but I was quite struck by the continuities and the commonalities between them. So I want to pick out some observations that I had, which I think work across the different projects and papers. And maybe, given there are so many detailed questions that arise for me in relation to each of them, maybe just to ask you all to reflect on a common question. So my observations clearly were that, governance, which Václav and Michaela set the scene for us with in their presentation, is crucial throughout all of these schemes and different kinds of governmental actors or regulatory actors, if you will, from the multinational agencies, which Raul was referring to national governments, municipal, local governments, but also the everyday work of governance by organizations like Arnica and also local residents. Political will emerged as an issue throughout, and although Václav and Michaela were stressing the particular challenges of the post-socialist context, many of the problems and issues that they were describing seem to me very familiar from a range of other contexts, including my own. In your paper, you talk about the fact that one of the schemes, the one that Bieno was working on, and you referred to this in the presentation, some of the feedback you got was to say, we need a leader, we need a local leader who's going to invest all their time. So that kind of like the water champions that Raoul was speaking about in the context of Bogor. So how do you enroll these sort of street level or neighborhood level politicians and champions in that sense? I was also struck when Raoul mentioned the fact that in Australia, which is, you know, an extremely effective, comprehensive, well-resourced system of government at very many different scales. I grew up in Australia, and Raoul, I got stuck in Melbourne during lockdown, so I know the city very well. I got back to London in July. It's a very highly governed society, with a number of effective layers of governance. But you were saying the kind of codes which Václav and Michaela were calling for as being absolutely imperative in the context of Czechia, these are voluntary in Australia as well. So political will and enforceability is an issue in very diverse cases. And just as there are scales of governance at work, obviously you're working through different spatial scales, from settlement to the neighborhood to the block scale. But many of the strategies are quite scalable across those different spaces. Thirdly, there was a clear emphasis in all of the presentations to a greater or lesser degree on blue and/or green infrastructures, but I was also taken by the way in which these have to be integrated into wider infrastructural systems around energy, for example, around waste, and certainly around transport, which you all touched on in various ways. And fourthly, I'd underline the importance of what Vasya called collective and connective spaces, again, across all of these scales, from the block to the settlement scale. These spaces of affordance in the Prague case, which may have become underused or underutilized, not exploited in the way that they were, but the potential that they hold, through to the disposition of public and private spaces in a co-housing space. And as Raoul was emphasizing, the importance of public spaces, even if they're not owned and regulated by the public, but public spaces in informal settlements. How do we create, design, provide, and secure those in contexts where space is at an absolute premium, and all those problems of having many owners and none, which was described in the first paper and emergent in the last as well, are particularly acute. So those are my observations against the three presentations. And I'd want to concentrate, I suppose, my question to ask each of you what you would identify as the single biggest challenge at the different scales and in the different contexts at which you're working. If you could get one thing right, if you could change one thing in the way that you would wish to do so, what would you identify as that, not magic bullet, but as that primary priority for each of you? Thank you again.
Thank you, Fran. Thank you, Roberta. Thank you, Sasha, for your comments and your questions. Just concerning time, we're now 12:25, so officially we would have 5 minutes. I hope you're fine with overrunning 10 minutes so that we give colleagues a chance to respond and then to wrap up. So I'd like, maybe we change order slightly. So I'm just looking at Raoul. Why don't we say responses go in the way that Raoul responds first, then Vasya, and then the colleagues from Prague here in the room. And after your responses, we then have 1-2 last statements to wrap this up. Okay, Raul, you want to start?
Okay, great. Yeah, can I start? Thank you very much for your comments and for your questions. Well, first, there was a question regarding the criteria of selection of places. Of course, this was always an issue when you are sort of looking for places upgrading in this context, because there are so many, right? There are so many informal settlements. There are so many areas that need sort of this transformation. But our goal, it was to apply this framework in different contexts with different conditions. So, for example, the first one I showed you, Puligulis, it was sort of applying the framework within a sort of informal settlement context in the island of Puligulis. And as I mentioned, we have 4 case studies. Second case study was sort of a more kind of normal neighborhood of sort of let's say community that it was sort of a little bit more sort of settled in an area, and we try also to look at different economic and environmental issues in each one of the places. Our third case study was sort of applying this into a larger scale sort of master plan area. So we apply, or we try to retrofit an existing master plan that it was proposed for an area and development around the lake. And we try to apply this framework within the sort of retrofitting this master plan to make it, let's say, more water sensitive in a way. And our 4 case study was selected sort of more high rank of application in a sort of a housing complex located in the periphery of the city, a little bit more high income, and try to apply this into sort of another level of income in the city. So I think our criteria was looking for this, looking for places where you have different conditions of different developments of the city, and try to look on different ways in which this can be applied. And also related to the question of the location of the green technology, I didn't have time to mention this, but especially perhaps not in the Puligulis project, but in the other case study around the lake that it was called Front City, we use some allocation of green technology based on GIS. So we run a lot of models, we run a lot of hydrology models that actually were showing us which are the best places in an area where you can put, for example, constructed wetlands on a retained basin or rain gardens. So we use this using different sort of tools, especially one developed from the APA called Sustain, that is sort of facilitating this allocation of the green technology, because most of the time it's not just having the technology, is where to put it, right? Where is more functional, especially when you have to decide to take these decisions based on money. So this was also one of the main things that we did, and it was also very attractive for government there, because they were looking for this sort of ways to sort of facilitate this location of a different green technology. And last question regarding the challenges in practice and related to everything that was mentioned about governance. Of course, I think the one of the things it was sort of working in these different scales, as you mentioned, very challenging when the responsibilities are not clear. For us, it was very tricky to get to know all the sort of law system in Indonesia, water law system in Indonesia, because when we were actually looking at this low water system, it was coming from the Dutch colonial times. So it was quite not updated, and we needed to actually interact within this law framework, and it was very tricky. But I think we learned a lot from it, and we also try to facilitate the implementation of regulation, as I was mentioning, policies or the development of policies promoting the adoption of these systems. As you mentioned, for example, in Australia, it's not mandatory. It relies on other sort of incentives, tax incentives, and so on. And of course, this can also be applied in other contexts, such as Indonesia or some other developing countries. So yeah, I think that that's mainly it. I'm just gonna leave it there to leave time for the other participants to answer the questions.
Thank you, Rahul. Vasya, what do you have to say? Can I ask you for one key learning point?
Okay, I'll try to be quickly. So regarding the question about the accessibility and the social interaction with the neighborhood, I think from the beginning, I really wanted to create a node, a connected node for the neighborhood. So let's say a social hub. And that can be shown by the fact that both the co-working space and the public, the urban orchards are open also to the neighborhood. They're not just for use of by the users. And I think Rome has the mentality already of sharing at least urban orchards and green spaces. So for the context of the city, I think there is high possibility of social interaction by this project. Of course, the problem is that always, like in Rome and in Italy, the housing plan keeps changing. There is a lot of bureaucracy. There are different levels of governance also. And so it's really difficult to bring all these people together and to create something continuous. There are a lot of initiatives, but mostly private initiatives in the city for green spaces, infrastructure for public or affordable housing. I think I will pass also by this to the last question that was about the challenge. I think it's participation and collaboration, to be honest. Like, I remember when I was visiting the city to collect some interviews and decide how this project should be integrated better in the urban context. There are a lot of people that are prone, not are prone, are willing to participate in creating more open spaces for the citizens. But usually there are always problems of property, of land property, because in Italy, in Rome, there are a lot of housing occupations, mostly during the crisis, the economical crisis. And there are also many initiatives like Eco Abitare, co-housing diffuso. There are really many, but they are small. And I think the problem is to collaborate to each other. So networking, like creating a base that can push, let's say, the local authorities also to create something more organized.
Okay, thank you, Vasya.
So thank you for your comments and remarks. I would maybe start with Roberta's question about whether we did this comparison to other case studies in former socialist countries. We haven't done like a proper comparative research, although in the literature, in the paper, you can find some articles that are either summing up the situation in Central Europe or also in some other post-socialist countries. But we really we didn't care that much about these, because we basically the goal of our case studies was to firstly discuss the problematic locations and bring some positive examples, some positive practice. So we actually did, as a second issue of this set of case studies, we actually did 3 case studies of positive practices from Vienna Ljubljana and Sheffield. So we focused on good practice rather than on case studies, which may have similar problems, but we mainly wanted to bring into the discussion the positive practice and positive cases. And so this actually is kind of connected with question of Fran, because like from my point of view and in terms of the practice and governance in Prague, I think at least for me personally, I'm speaking about myself, it's the most important thing to try to put the positive examples, whether we are speaking about climate change adaptation and mitigation or housing affordability, to put those examples, try to push them into the public discourse, because you may know that many social theorists consider the discourse as one of the most important elements in terms of distribution of power. So I think the shift of the public discourse is the start, and we are trying mainly to push these topics into the public discourse, which is actually still kind of dominated by kind of one-sided view of technicalities. Actually, it's kind of dominated by architects. There is this softer part missing in the public discourse, like the social aspects. So I think for us, this is the thing where it all starts.
Thank you.
Maybe Michaela, you want to?
I agree.
Okay.
Okay, no, thank you. I found it very interesting. I only would like to say that social science is not necessarily a soft science in the sense that the social very often is the very hard stuff. So no, it's interesting because it brings us in a specific relation to technical sciences, and I found always very challenging in our debate here in the EU Research Lab to have this, so to say, free exchange at the same level between different disciplines. And I think this is something very important for us also to interact A to A, so to say. Yeah, thank you very much. I found it very challenging, very interesting. I think that the idea of participation and collaboration is in the core of all our today. So creating collaborative spaces, creating opening space, gardens in ports, refurbishment of cities and so on. And this is partly something we cannot achieve only top-down, if we reuse these words via top-down strategy. So this is something I think has been very obvious this morning.
One thing that I take from today's discussion was my main learning point from yesterday was, not learning point, but one thing that struck me yesterday was how none of the presentations understood housing as a commodity, as I said earlier, but when we focused on the process. Now in today's case studies, what struck me that as one of the few kind of underlying threads that I found picked up everywhere was your focus on interfaces. I did not see a very classic understanding of housing, and I did not see a classic understanding of a single family home or a nuclear family apartment or something like this. But it was about co-living, co-housing. It was about the interface between the house and the environment. Of course, there was the focus on infrastructure, and in Raoul's presentation, when you have the results of your workshops and the presentation where you actually did interventions, it was always at spaces that linked things that usually at the fringe are perceived as in between, like between the public and the private. So it's always about these linkages. And Yeah, so there would be more to say, but I'd like to thank all of you for the presentations and also our members of the panel. From what we just said, is there any last comment, Sasha, from Roberta, that you'd like to share with us? No? Okay, okay.
It was really a very inspiring morning. I must thank you all for the presentations again, and also the comments I heard. So yeah, for me again, I mean, there's a certain tension, I think, between generic concepts, right? How to respond to these new challenges, global challenges, and the need to be specific and to react on site, and also to relate to certain architectural histories. And I think the presentations were kind of informing also these types of tensions. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll take all of this on board for our reflections this evening with our local policymakers. I wonder how that is going. Anyway, thank you very much for taking your time. Thank you very much also to the presenters for all your hard work and your case studies. And the work will continue, and we'll keep you informed.